There is a metal sitting inside the device you are using to watch this right now, and 200 years ago, a single gram of it was worth more than most people earned in a month. Not gold, not platinum, something you probably tossed in the trash this morning without a second thought. Here is what makes this story genuinely strange. This metal is not rare. It is not hidden in some remote volcanic deposit or locked inside a meteorite. It makes up nearly 1/10 of everything beneath your feet. Every stone, every cliff face, every handful of dirt from your garden. It has been there for longer than the oceans have existed. And yet for most of human history, not a single person on the planet had ever seen a solid piece of it, not touched it, not even glimpsed it. It existed only as a rumor inside chemistry notebooks, a ghost that everyone was certain must be there but nobody could reach. And then, within a single human lifetime, it went from being the centerpiece of imperial dining tables to the material of disposable packaging. The price collapsed by a factor of several hundred in less than 2 decades. A metal that emperors used as a symbol of power became something you wrap sandwiches in. How does that happen? How does the most coveted material in the world become an afterthought so fast that the generation who witnessed it could barely process what they had just watched? That question is what this story is actually about. But to answer it properly, we have to start somewhere unexpected. We have to start with a man named Elias Vorn, a self-taught metallurgist who worked out of a smoke-stained workshop near the docks of a mid-sized port city in the mid-19th century. No university affiliation, no laboratory funding, no assistant. Just a cast-iron furnace, a shelf of chemical reagents, and a set of handwritten notes that he kept in a water-damaged leather notebook. Elias was not famous. He was not well-connected, but he was, by every account recorded by the people who knew him, absolutely certain of one thing. There was a metal locked inside ordinary clay, and he was going to find a way to pull it out. He never did, but what he left behind changed everything, and almost nobody knows his name. The notebook surfaced decades after his death in the inventory of a small industrial trading house. The woman cataloging the estate records that day was not a chemist. She was an accountant named Mara Sen, hired to assess the value of a deceased client's assets. She almost discarded the notebook as personal correspondence. Something about the diagrams on the inside cover stopped her. She set it aside. She took it home. And in doing so, she accidentally preserved the single most important set of unpublished experiments in the history of material science. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Because before Elias, before Mara, before the trading house and the dockside workshop, there was a problem so fundamental that it stopped every brilliant mind in Europe cold for nearly a century. And to understand why this metal was so impossibly hard to reach, you first have to understand what was actually standing between it and the people trying to find it. Friends, if this story is already pulling you in, please subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps more than you might think, and there is a great deal more to come. So here is the problem. And it is a beautiful one, if you appreciate the way nature occasionally builds a perfect trap. This metal bonds to oxygen with a grip that makes iron look casual by comparison. The moment it forms, it reaches out and grabs the nearest oxygen atom and holds on with a force that no furnace built in the 19th century could overcome. A standard industrial furnace works by using carbon to steal oxygen from metal ore. Carbon essentially outcompetes the metal in a chemical tug-of-war. That works for iron. It works for copper. It works for a dozen other metals that humans had been smelting for thousands of years. It does not work here. This metal wins that competition every single time, at every temperature achievable with coal and bellows and fire. The carbon loses. The metal stays locked inside the clay. And so every chemist who approached this problem with a furnace walked away empty-handed, usually after years of effort. Sometimes after decades. Elias Vorn spent 11 years trying to crack it with heat alone. His final notebook entries describe experiments run at temperatures that warped the lining of his furnace 3 times in a single winter. He got close enough to see a faint metallic sheen on the surface of his samples. He wrote the word "promising" in the margin and underlined it twice. 6 weeks later, he was dead from a lung infection that had been worsening for years, almost certainly accelerated by the fumes from those extreme temperature experiments. His workshop was cleared out, his tools were sold, and his notebook sat in a trading house archive for nearly 30 years before Mara Sen picked it up off a shelf and changed the entire trajectory of this story. The clay beneath your feet right now contains more of this metal than any mine on Earth has ever produced. And for thousands of years, every single civilization that walked on it had absolutely no idea. Think about what that means for a moment. Ancient builders ground this metal's compounds into pigment and painted their walls with it. Textile workers dissolved its salts into boiling vats and used it to fix dye permanently into fabric. Healers packed its powder into wounds because it stopped bleeding faster than anything else they had. The Roman writer Pliny described one of its compounds in detail in the 1st century, called it essential, traded it across the Mediterranean like a strategic resource. Entire economies ran on substances that were, at their chemical core, built around this one hidden element. And not a single person across all of those centuries thought to ask what was actually inside the compound doing all that work. This is not a story about ignorance. The people using these substances were not primitive or careless. They were practical. They knew what worked. They just never had a reason to look deeper, because looking deeper required a framework of thinking about matter that simply did not exist yet. The idea that a hard gray clay mineral might contain a shining metal locked inside it, the way a walnut contains a kernel, that idea was not available to a Roman dyer or an Egyptian craftsman. It became available very slowly and only to a very specific kind of mind, the kind that looks at something ordinary and refuses to accept that ordinary is the whole answer. Elias Vorn was exactly that kind of mind. We talked about him already, the dockside metallurgist with the damaged notebook and the ruined furnace lining. But Elias did not appear from nowhere. He was the endpoint of a long chain of people who each pulled one thread and handed it to the next person without knowing they were doing it. And to really feel the weight of what Elias almost accomplished, you need to understand just how hard every person before him hit the same wall. The first serious attempt to isolate this metal came from a chemist working in a modest laboratory in a northern German city. He had already made his name by extracting sugar from beets and refining zinc in ways no one had managed before. He heated the clay compounds, broke them apart chemically, and extracted a fine white powder. He named it and wrote it up carefully. What he had was the metal's oxide, its outermost shell, the very layer that makes the metal so impossible to reach. He had peeled back one layer of the onion and found another layer underneath. Progress, real progress. But the metal itself was still hiding. Then came a chemist in Paris, one of the most brilliant minds of his generation, who listed this metal among the elements he believed must exist but could not yet prove. He wrote that someone would eventually find a way to extract it. He did not live to see it happen. History removed him from the story before he could finish his part in it, which is one of the crueler details in this whole account. Then came a researcher in London who had already pulled several other metals out of their compounds using electrical current. He tried the same approach here. He passed current through the oxide, watched for a reaction, and got the faintest possible hint of something metallic at the electrode. He could not isolate it. He could not reproduce it cleanly, but he was close enough to give the metal its name, the name it still carries today, which means that a man who failed to extract it still left his fingerprints all over its identity. Then came a physicist in a northern coastal city who announced he had actually done it. He had a sample. He described it. His colleagues spent the next 30 years arguing about whether what he produced was the real thing or an impurity masquerading as success. The argument was never fully resolved in his lifetime. And through all of this, through a century of brilliant people running at the same locked door, the metal sat in the clay and waited. Patient in the way that only something without consciousness can be patient. Which is to say, absolutely and completely, and without any awareness of the people exhausting themselves trying to reach it. What none of them had was the key, and the key turned out to be something that barely existed when most of them were working. Electricity. Not a trickle of it, not a laboratory curiosity, but electricity in serious industrial quantities, enough to force apart a chemical bond that heat alone could never touch. The moment that kind of electricity became available, everything was going to change. But first, someone had to figure out exactly how to use it, and that someone was going to be very young, very unknown, and working in conditions that no serious institution would have funded. What Mara Sen found in Elias Vorn's notebook was not a solution. It was a map that showed exactly where all the previous attempts had gone wrong, and one final entry, written in a shakier hand than the rest, that pointed directly at the answer nobody had tried yet. The last entry in Elias Vorn's notebook was written in a hand so unsteady that Mara Sen initially mistook it for a smear. When she finally deciphered it under a lamp late one evening, she sat back in her chair and did not move for a long time. The entry did not describe a failed experiment. It described a direction. A very specific, very clear direction that Elias had never had the time or the health to follow. He had written that heat was the wrong tool entirely, that the bond holding this metal inside its oxide was not a mechanical problem to be forced open with temperature, but an electrical one, to be unpicked with current. He had no equipment to test this. He had no funding. He had a theory and a failing body and a notebook that was about to spend 3 decades in a trading house archive. Mara was not a scientist, but she understood value, which is the entire reason she was hired to catalog estates in the first place. She recognized that what she was holding was not personal correspondence. She brought the notebook to a professor at a nearby technical college, a man named Dr. Fenric Hall, who specialized in industrial chemistry. She expected him to dismiss it. He did not. He read it twice, set it down on his desk, and told her quietly that if Vorn's final hypothesis was correct, then an enormous number of very smart people had been wasting their time for a very long time. Hal spent the better part of a year trying to verify Vorn's reasoning through existing published research. What he found was striking. Every serious attempt to isolate the metal had used heat as the primary tool. Every single one. The London researcher who had passed electrical current through the oxide had been on the right path, but had used the oxide in solid form, and solid oxide does not conduct current well enough to make the process work. The key insight buried in Vorn's final entry was different. He had not written about passing current through solid material. He had written about dissolving the oxide first, melting it into something liquid, and then applying current to the liquid. The metal ions would then be free to move, and the current would drag them toward the electrode and force them to become metal. The problem was temperature. The oxide melts at a temperature so extreme that sustaining it industrially was essentially impossible at the time. Vorn had known this. It was why he had not pursued the idea himself. But in that same final entry, cramped into the margin, in the shakiest handwriting of all, there was a single word. A mineral name. A substance that Vorn had apparently encountered in a shipment of raw geological samples that passed through the port near his workshop. A mineral that, when melted, could dissolve the oxide at a temperature far more manageable. Around 960 degrees rather than nearly 3,000. Hall recognized the mineral immediately. He had seen samples of it in a university collection. It was uncommon but not impossible to obtain. And when he ran the numbers on what Vorn was proposing, he understood in a way that made his hands actually unsteady that this was not a dead end. This was a door, a real one. and it had been sitting in a dead man's notebook in a trading house archive for 30 years because nobody with the right background had ever looked at it. He wrote up a summary of his findings and sent copies to 3 colleagues in different cities. All 3 responded within a month. All 3 said the same thing in different words. This needs to be tested immediately. Now here is where the story gets genuinely strange, because what happened next did not involve Hall. He was too senior, too established, too embedded in institutional work to drop everything and chase an unverified hypothesis from an unpublished notebook. The person who actually ran with it was 22 years old, had no academic position, and was working in a converted storage room at the back of his family's property on the outskirts of a provincial town. His name was Tobias Wren, and he had been a student of Hall's for exactly 1 semester before running out of money and returning home. Hall had sent him a copy of the summary almost as an afterthought, knowing Tobias had a furnace at home and too much energy and nothing else to do with it. Tobias read the summary in 1 sitting. Then he read it again. Then he walked out to the storage room and started rearranging the equipment he had been using to run small metallurgical experiments since the age of 17. The mineral Vorn had named in that final cramped margin note was obtainable. Tobias had actually seen something similar in a mineral sample kit he had ordered from a catalog 2 years earlier. He pulled the kit off the shelf, found the sample, held it under the light, and felt the particular kind of excitement that only arrives when you realize you might already have exactly what you need. What came next would either prove that a forgotten dockside metallurgist had been right all along, or confirm that Elias Vorn had died chasing a very beautiful mistake. Tobias Wren ran his first successful experiment on a Tuesday morning and did not tell a single person for 3 days. Not because he was secretive, because he genuinely could not believe what he was looking at. He had set up the bath the night before, packed the dissolved oxide into the mineral melt, connected his electrical apparatus, and left it running through the night with a clay damper holding the temperature steady. When he came back at dawn, the storage room smelled of hot mineral and something sharper, something almost metallic in the air itself. He checked the bath. At the bottom of the vessel, settled under the cooling melt like a coin dropped into still water, was a small bright disk of solid metal. Not powder, not a smear, not a hint of something that might be metallic if you wanted it badly enough. A clean, solid, unmistakable piece of metal, roughly the size of a shirt button. He picked it up with iron tongs. It was heavier than it looked for its size. Silver white with a surface that reflected the gray morning light coming through the storage room window. He turned it over, both sides smooth, both sides gleaming. He set it on the workbench and sat down on an upturned crate and stared at it for a long time without moving. Then he went inside and ate breakfast without saying anything to his mother, who noted later that he seemed unusually calm for someone who had been up all night. He ran the experiment again that afternoon, same result. Larger disk this time. He ran it a 3rd time 2 days later, adjusting the current strength, and produced 3 separate pieces in a single session. That was when he wrote to Dr. Hall. The letter was short. It said only that Vorn had been right, that the process worked, and that Tobias needed help obtaining a larger electrical source because the limiting factor was now power, not chemistry. Hall arrived within 2 weeks. He stood in the converted storage room, looked at the small collection of metal pieces lined up on the workbench, and said nothing for almost a minute. Then he picked one up, weighed it in his palm, bent it slightly between his fingers to test its softness, and set it back down. He told Tobias that what they were holding was going to require a decision, and that the decision needed to be made carefully, because the moment this result was published, everything was going to move very fast. He was right about that. But what neither of them anticipated was that the same result was already sitting in a laboratory on the other side of a mountain range. Produced by a young engineer named Corvin Lassie, who had arrived at the same solution through a completely different chain of reasoning and had filed a formal description of his method with a patent registry just weeks before Tobias sent his letter to Hall. Corvin had not read Vorn's notebook. He had never heard of Elias Vorn at all. He had come at the problem from the direction of electrical engineering rather than metallurgy, working backwards from the question of what a sustained high-current bath could theoretically dissolve and reduce, rather than from the question of what the metal needed chemically. He had identified the same mineral as the ideal solvent through a process of elimination that took him almost 2 years of testing. His notes were meticulous, his apparatus was better funded, and his results were cleaner than Tobias's early attempts. But his documented experiments started later. The timeline was close enough that lawyers would eventually spend years arguing about it. The priority dispute between Tobias Wren and Corvin Lassie became one of the more bitter and protracted disagreements in the history of industrial chemistry. Institutions took sides. Correspondence was scrutinized. The question of who deserved credit became entangled with questions of nationality, funding, and whose supporters had more influence in the relevant academic bodies. It was not a clean story. It was not a story where the right person simply won and everyone accepted it gracefully. But here is the thing that history eventually settled on, not immediately, but over the following decades. Both men had done it. The method bore both their names. And the method itself was so profoundly important that the question of who deserved the larger share of the credit eventually became secondary to what the method actually did to the world. Because what it did to the world was this. Within a few years of the first industrial plant opening using the Wren-Lassie process, the price of the metal that had once sat behind glass in jewelry store windows began to fall. Not gradually, not smoothly. It fell the way a wall falls when the foundation gives way all at once. And the people who had built entire commercial identities around the metal's scarcity watched that scarcity dissolve in real time, and most of them had no idea what to do about it. There was one man who saw it coming before almost anyone else. And what he did with that knowledge is a story that has almost nothing to do with chemistry and almost everything to do with how power actually works when a resource stops being rare. Tobias Wren never became wealthy. He died in a modest house in the same provincial town where he had run those first experiments, respected within a narrow circle of specialists and largely unknown outside it. Corvin Lass did better financially, partly because his institutional connections gave him access to investors that Tobias never cultivated. But neither man was the one who truly profited from what they had unlocked. The person who profited was someone who had been watching both of them very carefully from a distance, waiting for exactly the right moment to move. The man who profited most from the Wren-Lass process never ran a single experiment in his life, and he understood the metal better than almost anyone who did. His name was Edmund Cray. He was not a chemist or an engineer. He was an industrialist from a port city, the kind of man who spent his mornings reading shipping manifests and his evenings reading patent filings. He had been tracking the development of this metals extraction problem for years, not out of scientific curiosity, but out of the particular cold patience of someone who knows that a locked door will eventually open and wants to be standing on the right side of it when it does. He had read summaries of every published attempt. He had corresponded quietly with several researchers. When Hall's initial summary circulated among the academic community, a copy reached Cray within a month through a contact at a technical journal. He read it once, set it aside, and began making arrangements. By the time Tobias Wren's letter arrived at Hall's office, Cray had already identified 3 possible sites for a large-scale smelting operation. He needed rivers. Fast ones, with serious elevation drop. Because the one thing the Wren-Lassie process required above everything else was electricity in quantities that simply could not come from a coal-fired generator without making the whole operation economically pointless. Hydroelectric power was the only path to cheap aluminum, and cheap aluminum was the only version of this story that changed the world. Cray understood this with absolute clarity before most of the scientists involved had even thought about the industrial implications of what they were building. He approached Tobias first. The meeting was brief, and by Tobias's own account, recorded in a letter to a friend, somewhat uncomfortable. Cray was not unkind, but he was precise in the way that people are precise when they have already made a decision and are simply communicating it rather than discussing it. He offered funding, facilities, and a share of future production revenue in exchange for full licensing rights to the process. Tobias accepted, partly because he had no real alternative, and partly because what Cray was describing, an actual industrial plant, actual production at scale, was something Tobias genuinely wanted to see exist. He cared about the metal more than he cared about the business around it. Cray cared exclusively about the business, which meant they needed each other in a way that was useful, if not entirely comfortable. The first plant opened near a river junction in a valley region where the water ran fast and cold year-round. The sound of it on the first day of operation was extraordinary, a deep electrical hum underneath the roar of the turbines, the two sounds layered together into something that felt less like machinery and more like the landscape itself had been persuaded to do something new. Workers stood at the edges of the production floor and watched liquid metal settle into molds and felt the particular mixture of pride and unease that comes from witnessing something genuinely unprecedented. Within 18 months, a second plant opened, then a third. The price of the metal dropped sharply with each new facility, not because Cray wanted it to, but because production volume simply made lower prices inevitable. And here is where the story takes a turn that Cray himself had not fully anticipated. As the price fell, demand did not just grow, it exploded. Industries that had never considered this metal because it was too expensive suddenly found themselves redesigning products around it. Its weight, roughly a third of steel for comparable structural applications, made it immediately attractive to anyone building something that needed to move. Transport, construction. Eventually, aviation. The metal that had once been reserved for imperial dining tables was now being rolled into sheets and riveted into the frames of the first serious flying machines. Engineers who had been struggling with the weight constraints of wooden and steel frames suddenly had a material that could bear structural loads at a fraction of the mass. The first generation of powered aircraft was built around this property so completely that removing the metal from that era of aviation history is not a simplification, it is a structural impossibility. The planes do not fly without it. The math simply does not work. And none of that would have happened without a fast river, a businessman with cold patience, and a storage room in a provincial town, where a 22-year-old stayed up all night watching a bath of molten mineral. But the story does not end with aircraft. It does not end with Cray's expanding network of smelters, or with the patent dispute between Tobias and Corvin finally settling into an uneasy shared credit. It ends somewhere much stranger and much quieter, in a geological survey camp in the highlands of West Africa, which is exactly where we started. The geologist running that survey, a woman named Dr. Sila Moro, was not there for the ore. She was there for something the mining company financing the camp had no interest in at all. She was measuring concentrations of a radioactive isotope produced in surface rock by cosmic ray bombardment, a slow accumulation that acts as a natural clock. The higher the concentration, the longer the surface had been exposed to open sky. By reading these concentrations across different points in the landscape, she could reconstruct when glaciers had retreated, when landslides had reshaped the terrain, when entire mountain faces had been exposed for the first time in tens of thousands of years. She was reading geological time through the same element that was being smelted in industrial quantities a few kilometers away. The mining company saw commodity tonnage in that rock. Sila saw a record of deep time that no human instrument had written and no human hand could have preserved. The same element, the same atoms in the same stone, serving two completely different purposes simultaneously, one measured in quarterly production reports, and one measured in ice ages. When the camp was abandoned, it was Sela who stayed behind to finish her measurements. The rest of the team left in trucks at dawn. She worked alone through the afternoon in the particular silence of a recently vacated place, where the absence of people feels louder than noise. She collected her final samples, packed her instruments, and drove out as the sun dropped behind the ridge. Her data, published some months later in a geological journal, revised the estimated timing of a major regional glacial retreat by several thousand years. It was read by perhaps 300 specialists worldwide and cited in a handful of subsequent papers. Meanwhile, the ore from that same region was being processed into structural components for aircraft, building facades, and the casings of consumer electronics. The same highland soil feeding two entirely different kinds of knowledge, one loud and industrial and economically enormous, the other quiet and precise and almost entirely invisible to the people holding the metal in their hands every day. This is the thing that this whole story keeps returning to, and I want to say it plainly because it is easy to miss when you are watching prices collapse and plants open and patent lawyers argue. The metal was never the discovery. The metal was always there. What changed was not the substance but the question being asked of it. Elias Vorn asked a better question than everyone before him and died before he could answer it. Mara Sen asked why a dead man's notebook smelled like something important and preserved it when she could have discarded it. Tobias Wren asked whether a mineral sample from a catalog kit might be the key that a century of industrial chemists had overlooked. Each of them was not discovering something new. Each of them was finally learning to see something that had been in plain view the entire time, in the clay, in the rock, in the margins of a water-damaged notebook sitting on a shelf in a trading house archive. The rarest thing in this entire story is not the metal. It is the habit of asking a question that everyone around you has already decided is not worth asking. Now here is the question I want to leave you with, and I genuinely want to know your answer in the comments. If something as common as dirt turned out to contain one of the most transformative materials in human history, simply because nobody had asked the right question yet, what do you think is sitting around us right now, hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to finally look at it differently? What is the aluminum of our time? If this story made you think, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps this kind of content reach more people, and there is a great deal more like this still to come.